მოგესალმებით, მე მგონი შეგვიძლია დავიწყო, უმეტესობა სტუმრების უკვე დარბაზში იმყოფება. მოხარული ვარ კიდევ ერთხელ გიმასპინძლოთ ნატო-საქართველოს სახალხო დიპლომატიის ფორუმზე, რადგან ესე მრავალრიცხოვნად გამოცხადდით, ეს გვაძლევს იმედს, რომ პირველი დღე უკვე საინტერესო იყო თქვენთვის და ძალიან გვახარებს. პირველ რიგში მინდა რამოდენიმე წუთი წაგართვათ და უდიდესი მადლობა გადავუხადო იმ ადამიანებს, ვინც ორგანიზების პროცესში იყვნენ ჩართულები, საგარეო საქმეთა სამინისტროს თითოეულ თანამშრომელს, ნატოსა და ევროკავშირის შესახებ საინფორმაციო ცენტრის თანამშრომლებს, ნატოს სახალხო დიპლომატიის განყოფილებას, ნატოს სამეკავშირო ოფისს საქართველოში და პოლონეთის საელჩოს. დიდი მადლობა, თქვენი მხარდაჭერის გარეშე შეუძლებელი იქნებოდა წარმატებული ფორუმის ჩატარება. დღევანდელი ორი პანელი მოქალაქეების მედეგობის გაძლიერების პროცესში განათლების და ინფორმაციის როლს დაეთმობა. ორივე თემა ჩვენი ცენტრის ძირითად ფუნქციამოვალეობას წარმოადგენს. საქართველოს ევროპული და ევროატლანტიკური ინტეგრაციის შესახებ ინფორმაციის გავრცელება ჩვენი ყოველდღიური საქმიანობაა. ამ კუთხით აქტიურად მუშაობთ, როგორც იცით, საქართველოს მასშტაბით. ჩვენი ცენტრის გაძლიერების პროცესში უდიდესი წვლილი შეიტანა ამერიკის საელჩოს მიერ ჩვენი ცენტრისადმი აღმოჩენილმა ფინანსურმა დახმარებამ. ამისთვის კიდევ ერთხელ დიდი მადლობა. კიდევ ერთხელ მსურს საგარეო საქმეთა სამინისტროს ნატოსა და ევროკავშირის შესახებ საინფორმაციო ცენტრის სახელით მადლობა გადავუხადო ამერიკის შეერთებული შტატების სახელმწიფო დეპარტამენტის წარმომადგენლებს და საქართველოში ამერიკის საელჩოს. დიდი მადლობა, გისურვებთ ნაყოფიერ საინტერესო ფორუმს.
Thank you very much, Tamar. And on this occasion, good morning, first of all, dear guests, dear friends, dear colleagues. Many thanks for organizing this meeting. I think since yesterday we had the opportunity to listen to many good speakers. So, I mean, our task is becoming more difficult this second day. I mean, because we have a comparison behind us. But anyway, I think the organizers put together a very good panel to discuss education and resilience. Certainly, the title of the panel, at least for me, it's a bit complicated to approach, perplexed. It leaves me very perplexed, I would say. But on the other hand, having worked for now almost 20 years for NATO's public diplomacy, I remember that at the beginning I was also responsible for the educational programs of the organization, what we called at the time academic program. Then the academic program was abolished. Then slowly we developed programs that had the potential to reach out to what we call bigger audiences. I mean, not only the multipliers, but audiences, very, very useful audiences like youth, women, uneducated people, and so on. Having said that, I mean, I was thinking, when I started preparing, I mean, this panel, I was thinking that the whole system of our values is based on education. I mean, there would be no Western liberal system if there were no academic institution, especially in US and UK, certainly in other parts of the world, but especially in US and UK, academic institutions have paved the way to the generation of ideas. I mean, and I'm sure still this is their vocation. And then, I mean, these ideas secured the promotion of democracy through education and information, because democracy is based on well-informed citizens, after all. It's all about. Now, what we have now is that we have, of course, a massive education, because education with globalization has become a global business, we may say. So there is plenty of education and plenty of people educated or willing to be educated. But nevertheless, when it comes to public diplomacy, and I think, and communication, because I think this is the topic of our discussion today. When it comes to public diplomacy, not only our organization, NATO, but all organizations, international or regional organizations, as well as the countries, invested very much in social media or digital communication, which is, of course, necessary. Because you cannot reach the global audiences without social media or without digital communication. But there comes the problem, because digital communication is a very condensed communication, very short communication. And certainly you can be very smart, very intelligent, as some people think they are. And they communicate with 140. 140 is the Twitter limit. So certainly you can pass the message with 140 characters, but on the other hand, first of all, I don't think, and this is why I would like to invite you to discuss on it, if with 140 characters we have well-educated citizens after all, or if, social media do not reproduce the bubble of specific audiences. So you cannot reach to other audiences if you limit your communication to social media. So I'm not here to talk myself. The floor is for you. So, but I would like just, to spread some thoughts and to invite you to start discussing on this, as I said, very complex issue. So, Ambassador, let's start with you.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to join this very distinguished panel. And I also would like to express our special thanks to the Georgian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, to the EU and NATO Information Center, as well as to the Embassy of Poland for their support for this very timely event. We believe that strengthening resilience in a society against disinformation, and against propaganda is an important responsibility that Georgia shares with its Western partners, as well as with NATO as an institution. Georgia's European and Euro-Atlantic integration process requires security, democratic growth, and economic growth and development, and enhancing resilience within Georgian society advances all of these goals. And I certainly believe that education is a very essential tool in building resilience, because what education does is it empowers the citizens as individuals and as a collective to take on, to accept and fulfill their responsibility for building and maintaining a democratic society and being parts of the institutions that underpin a democratic society. I think that Georgians today increasingly recognize, in fact overwhelmingly recognize, that enhancing their national security will foster increased foreign investment, will create jobs domestically, and will ultimately improve the quality of life for all the citizens of the country. And the United States Embassy has been working very hard for many years to promote the strong ties between Georgia and the United States that help Georgia on this path. Through engagement with the Georgian public, we and our allies seek to confirm constantly Georgia's clear choice for integration into Western institutions, including NATO, and to build its capacity as a member of that community of nations. The United States, of course, unwaveringly supports Georgia's eventual membership into NATO. And when we support Georgia's unity, its independence, and democracy, we prepare Georgia for the day when it will become a member of the alliance. I strongly believe that we as an international community cannot ignore the very significant role that social and economic conditions play in Georgia's security. And as we work together to build the strong domestic economy based on a stronger agricultural sector, reviving old industries and building new ones, and especially developing Georgia's service economy to help develop the trade and investment links connecting the traditional Silk Road route and new regional and global connections that we also help to unite parties across the political spectrum behind the idea that Georgia should be able to determine its own future. And we believe that the one single thing that best promotes democratic development and economic growth and security is education. Because a well-educated nation is better equipped, better able to govern itself, to employ itself, and to secure itself. In short, a well-educated nation is a more resilient nation to any challenges that may come its way. We all know that Georgians across all regions and across all ethnic lines, by a very large majority, share a strong commitment to strengthening their education system, and the United States is supporting Georgia and has long supported Georgia in fulfilling this commitment. As I think has been said here already, the Georgian government has set very ambitious goals in the education reform field, doubling education spending as a percentage of GDP from just over 3% to 6% by 2022. This funding is going to advance a very ambitious education reform agenda that's going to contribute to the country's democratic development as well as to its prosperity. And so we welcome the Education Ministry's comprehensive introduction of student-centered instruction teaching methodologies. We believe that this will help to transform Georgia's teacher training institutions into more adaptable, self-sustaining models of excellence. And we think that this will help to prepare a new cadre of teachers who are even more able to impart to Georgian young people critical thinking skills so that they are able to make informed choices and themselves distinguish disinformation from information. We are especially proud of the role that the United States government's Millennium Challenge Corporation has played in advancing education here in Georgia from the primary grades through post-secondary. The $140 million compact that just has wrapped up here has focused, at the request of the Georgian government, on the science, technology, engineering, and math fields. But at the same time, it has equipped students at all levels to be more critical thinkers, to apply scientific methodologies, to apply laboratory experiences across the curriculum and into critical thinking choices that they will also face in their lives. We think that this second compact of the Millennium Challenge Corporation has done a lot to create a pipeline of well-informed young people backed up by better prepared educators who are going to be huge contributors to innovation and Georgia's economic growth and thereby resilience down the future. And the compact is expected to benefit ultimately about 1.7 million Georgians in the coming years. While the Second Millennium Challenge Corporation Compact has finished the formal part of its operations here, we have a lot more investment in education here in Georgia. We're about to launch a new USAID program of support to education. I should say USAID was actually getting out of the education field for the most part, but the Georgian government asked us please to remain engaged. And for that reason, we are starting a new project that will be called Education for a Lifetime of Success. And it's going to be focusing on strengthening the capacity of key educational institutions and closing the educational gap, especially in remote areas and in Georgia's ethnic minority areas. We also have a USAID program called Momavlis Taoba, Future Generation, that is aimed specifically at civic education in the high schools. And I've met with kids who've been going through this program, and their level of social awareness and engagement is very, very impressive. We also support Georgia's universities to provide modern, practical, tertiary education in many different fields, such as journalism, law, and teacher training. We also, through programs of USCID and our public affairs section and MCC, have done a lot to promote entrepreneurship, which has as its heart self-responsibility, risk-taking, and initiative, key elements of resilience at an individual level. These young entrepreneurs are going to also be key to Georgia's economic growth. Another thing that we support through a variety of different embassy programs is English language education. We consider greater access to information in English and better command of the English language essential because it gives especially citizens in minority areas access to a wider range of information, makes them less dependent on disinformation in languages that may come from malign sources. Of course, creates a citizenry that has more access to jobs in the global economy and therefore to greater prosperity. Another example of our longstanding commitment to education here in Georgia is the Peace Corps. So for many years, Peace Corps volunteers have been working throughout Georgia, especially in the regions, to teach the English language, but also to help students have a wider appreciation of the world around them and of the international experiences that they might face in their lives. And we also have a special cadre of Peace Corps volunteers who are, at the request of the Georgian government, embedded in different ministries here in Tbilisi, helping to build capacity. And we have volunteers who are working with civil society and civic organizations and NGOs as well throughout Georgia's regions, again, helping to build the institutions of resilience. We support more than 20 different exchange programs. We send more than 200 students and professionals to the United States each year for study, as well as individualized programs. And we bring Americans here to Georgia to conduct research and share their expertise through programs, including the Fulbright program. Again, I would say that critical thinking and intellectual tools for resilience are something that cut across all of these areas. Critical thinking isn't something that's taught in one class, nor is resilience, nor is distinguishing information from disinformation, a very discrete part of a curriculum, but really something that I would suggest should be part of every subject from the primary level to the secondary and tertiary level in order that citizens enter the workforce, enter society truly prepared to do their part. And education shouldn't be limited to the classroom either. All of the ideas and efforts and the breakthroughs that happen need to be widely understood and shared with our partners inside and outside of Georgia. And that's where strategic communications come in. They're vital to promoting Georgia as a developing country with Western values and a favorable business environment. Georgia has made tremendous progress in this area. The United States is proud of the role that it has played. Our funding, for example, for the EU and NATO Information Center has helped the center to conduct thousands more awareness-raising activities. We've helped to add 5 offices in Georgia's regions, and especially in regions that are more vulnerable to malign external influence. We very much look forward to this continued collaboration with the Georgian government, with other partners represented here. We think that there's a lot of work to do. I could say more, but I think I've used enough time, and I want to give the other panelists plenty of opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador, for describing so comprehensively the landscape in Georgia. Indeed, we are not starting from scratch in Georgia, because Georgia is an educated country. I mean, they have a very good level of universities and very well-informed public. But nevertheless, they face especially this decade, they are facing very, very complex, not only information challenges, but security challenges. This is why, I mean, our support and assistance is very, very important. And certainly we all trying, I mean, to bring together Georgian governmental and non-governmental actors, because, I mean, disinformation and propaganda is not only the job of government to tackle it. It's not only the job of governmental actors. I mean, it's the society that has to react. And fortunately, this society has reacted, not only now and in the past. It's a vibrant civil society, and this is the added value of this country, that they do have a vibrant civil society that made spectacular changes throughout the years of independence, and hopefully, I mean, they are also keen to continue on this path. So, Ambassador, I mean, let's listen to your approach now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Despina, for that introduction. Thank you to the organizers. I hope you can all hear me. I feel a little bit like Michael Jackson or something with this. But I hope it's working and you can hear me clearly. Thank you to the organizers of this forum. I've been fortunate to have been at every one of these fora through the years. People now refer to me as a veteran ambassador. I don't know how I feel about that, but I have been to all these fora. And I can say that I think the intensity of the struggle that we are witnessing, that is being conducted through information, is only getting stronger. And I think the relevance of this forum, therefore, is also increasingly clear, and so it's an honour to take part again this year. And I very much welcome this focus on education. Like you, Despina, when I first saw the title, I was a little bit uncertain. It doesn't immediately strike you as an issue that you would see on this kind of agenda, but when you stop and you think about it, you begin to recognize how fundamental it is to what we are doing. You made a very clear link to democracy. I agree with that. And while faced by this intense struggle that I talked about, we are looking for rapid and quick responses. Education may not be one of those rapid responses, but truly in terms of its longer-term transformational impact, it is very important indeed. I'm just going to say a few words by way of introduction. I think a key part of education, an underappreciated part of education, is actually listening rather than talking. And we have some genuine experts on this panel who I would be very interested to listen to. And I hope we will also get into a discussion with the audience as well. So I'll make a few short general observations first, and then finish with some more practical examples of where I think education is helping to strengthen resilience. So firstly, the general observations. I mean, I think the three things that stand out for me as linking education and resilience are very much in line with what Elizabeth has just said. You know, at this point about critical thinking, you know, at its most basic level, effective education in civics, history, global issues creates a better informed population, and that in turn encourages informed and active citizens to take part in the democratic processes, strengthening institutions and resilience. This point about empowerment that Elizabeth raised, I think, is very important. Secondly, and leading on from that better informed society, education really is, in NATO terms, the first line of defense. First line of defense against disinformation, against hostile uses, malicious uses of information. And as a growing segment of our societies, of our populations, are aware of or able to identify disinformation, they are almost immediately less likely to be influenced by that disinformation. And it's becoming clearer and clearer that if you give people the opportunity to build those skills and awareness from a young age, the contribution that makes to building resilience at the national level over time is significant. That critical thinking, that raised awareness, also has a sort of very concrete result in that it increases the cost to any adversary, in that they have to adopt ever more sophisticated approaches, ever more expensive, costly approaches, in order to sow discord and achieve their goals. And then my third sort of general observation about the connection between education and resilience is this point, this sort of economic point. A society is really most resilient when it is economically active, economically successful. And this depends very directly on effective education, including vocational and technical education to promote a society's prosperity. So 3 observations about the link between education and resilience. A few practical examples which I think demonstrate that connection. I could, like Elizabeth, there's lots to say, and I won't go into every example, but I could talk briefly about some excellent models of media literacy work that are underway here in Georgia and elsewhere in this region. And if you look at education in its broadest sense, there are also excellent examples of where Georgian organizations are working with key influencers, such as the senior clergy of the Georgian Orthodox Church and other religious leaders, leaders of other faiths in Georgia, to counter the influence of disinformation and malicious propaganda. But I won't go into more detail on those particular examples now. The 2 examples I wanted to focus on in just a little bit more detail are, firstly, language, English. Elizabeth mentioned it as well. The example I have is a network of English clubs, English language clubs that the UK has been supporting in Georgia and across the Eastern Partnership region for 2 or 3 years now, together with the British Council. In Georgia, we now have 13 of these clubs. Mostly, in fact, as you described it, Elizabeth, in vulnerable communities or marginalized communities. I went to one, I've been to a few of them, but one that really stuck in my memory is one in Tbilisi, which is in Shidakartli, which, as Georgian members of the audience will know, is divided by the administrative boundary line, the artificial line of separation cut across Georgia by Russian-backed forces, just 10 kilometers away from that line. And we have an English club there that runs at the local community centre. And it's hard to get in because there are so many people there. The interest and the popularity of these clubs is extraordinary. But what struck me was not just the popularity, nor the quality of the English language skills, which was really impressive, genuinely impressive. These are 14-year-olds, 15-year-olds, really impressive. Some of it gained through the English club, a lot of it gained through YouTube and other English language resources. But what really struck me was not the quality of the language, but it was the quality of the ideas that they were using their English language skills to discuss. So ideas about tolerance, ideas about rights and responsibilities, and ideas about equality of opportunity. And it was a very clear demonstration to me of the power of language skills, the power of English in unlocking that kind of critical thinking. And it gave me a huge amount of optimism, by the way, in terms of Georgia's future. The second practical example I wanted to refer to as well is this idea of scholarships. Now, it's not a new idea, of course. Elizabeth mentioned Fulbright. Our flagship scholarship program is called Chevening. It's been going for about 30 years now. In the case of Georgia, I'm hugely proud that we have more than 250 alumni, some of whom I see in the audience today in Georgia, who have spent a year in the UK completing master's degrees. And that's a fantastic resource, and it's an amazing sort of investment in the future of our close relationship. But the particular example I wanted to refer to today is less well known, is that in recent years we've also been offering these scholarships to young students from the Georgian regions of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And we do that in a way that is totally respectful of the Georgian government's non-recognition policy and totally consistent with UK support for Georgia's sovereignty and territorial integrity. But at the same time, we are able to offer a small number of young people from those Georgian regions the opportunity to engage with the outside world, an alternative to the only other education, higher education that is on offer to them, which is in Russia. And I feel it's a very, very powerful example of the importance of education, open, transparent, accessible education in pushing back against the sort of hostile information campaigns that we face. Ladies and gentlemen, let me finish briefly. I mean, in Georgia, in the Georgian context, when you think of the extraordinary centers of learning at Gelati and Ikalto, you realize that the connection between education and national identity, resilience, survival is not new. It's a very, very important and ancient connection, and it's one that we must focus on today as well. But I don't take my inspiration now from the Georgian history, but I take it from Georgia's present. Another great Georgian tradition is rugby. And since we're 2 days before the Rugby World Cup final, I hope you don't mind me using this analogy once again. Apologies to those that have heard it before. But anyone who knows a little bit about rugby knows that the key moment is the scrum, when you have 8 huge forwards pushing together against the opposing team. Now, when you have a strong scrum working together towards one goal, let's call that goal education. then there is really nothing that can stop it. But when that scrum is not united or coordinated or pushing in the same direction at the same time, then very quickly it starts to go backwards. And I believe that it's exactly that kind of scrum, that sort of whole of society effort that all of us need, whether in the UK, in Georgia, US, or wherever else, to build education systems that make us truly resilient. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for making all these very interesting points, linking education with the bringing up of a civil society, I mean, a resilient civil society. And certainly, I mean, we should to bear in mind that the other side is waging an ideological war. I mean, what is targeted by Russia is our model of life. It's not that they are targeting, of course, in Georgia they are waging a real war, of course, but against Europe, against the members of the Atlantic Alliance, they are waging a war of ideas, supporting that their ideas are better and more convenient to this part of the world. So this is why, I mean, I'm glad that we have with us today two very, very good experts coming from the academia. My good old friend Georgi Kelesvili, who was one of the first persons to navigate me in the very turbulent Caucasus waters when I first came to Georgia. And I hope a new friend, Neville Bolt, with whom I expect to follow up after this panel on how we can work on strategic communication, because, I mean, certainly we are not there at the point to tackle efficiently the challenges we face. So, Georgi, let's start with you.
Thank you. Well, also thank you to the organizers for putting together this very distinguished panel, but also organizing the conference that is one of the landmarks of relationship between Georgia and NATO. I hope that with future years it will become ever more interesting and also effective. I'll be talking more from the academic side, because that is what is my specialty. I'm less of a security expert. Like Ambassador said, when you look at the nexus, the connection between education and resilience, at first it is not immediately apparent. So there can be two perspectives on this. The first perspective is more long-term, how the reforms of the education system can enhance adaptability of the nation to the adverse effects of change, of unwelcome change. And the second can be more short-term, which is how to cope with, again, adverse effects of disinformation and malevolent propaganda. So briefly, what I'll be talking about is how these two concepts of education and resilience relate to each other in the Georgian context, then what Georgian education system and Georgian education reforms are doing, I think, to mitigate those effects, what the Western impact seems to be, and also what the future perspective of this Western-Georgian collaboration is in terms of education and resilience. And finally, I'll attempt also to figure out what the short-term possibilities are for the education system to help the national resilience. Overall, my argument is what we already heard on the panel, and I think there is a consensus among us on this. It is essentially resilience through critical thinking, democratic culture, and I would also add trust in state institutions. So let me start the talk with an example from Georgia's past of from the 20th century. A single higher educational institution, Tbilisi State University, helped the nation to navigate the decades of Soviet occupation, in a sense that the institution retained the spirit of Georgianness, of patriotism, but also sometimes rudimentary, sometimes more developed sense of critical thinking and skill of critical thinking, which also informed then formal or informal public debates in Georgia throughout the decades of Soviet occupation. While the matter of patriotism is amply present now, not only at Tbilisi State University, but in every single higher education or secondary education institution throughout Georgia, then what is still lacking is that component of critical thinking that can be actually crucial to national resilience. Therefore, I think that Georgia's education system has two challenges. The first challenge is that Georgian students, according to research, international research, under-prepares students at every level for societal challenges, basically for living in the society. It doesn't have to do with education in general terms, I mean, how many things you know, but it is sort of life skills, it's societal skills. And if you take the OECD average, Georgian students usually underperform there. And the second challenge is the culture of pluralism, which developed only after the demise of the Soviet Union, where there existed only one truth. And now, after 30 years, almost 30 years of the demise of the Soviet Union, we are still struggling with adopting pluralistic culture, not only in the society, but also in the education system. It is very interesting to observe where the changes were most rapid and most effective in terms of curriculum, in terms of adopting Western, more pluralistic curriculum. It was in social sciences that were newly developed after the demise of the Soviet Union. If you look at, and relatively so also law, but if you look at humanities and technical education, meaning exact sciences, you do not have that rapid transformation, and therefore American contribution to the reform in STEM, in this field of education, through Millennium Challenge Corporation and also through the collaboration with San Diego State University, I think were a very, very good stepping stones for taking the country forward. And also, we should also mention the well-anticipated establishment of the Technological University in West Georgia that hopefully will inherit and then take the process even further. So essentially, as I mentioned, the critical element of resilience is trust in state institutions and the legitimacy of democratically elected authorities. And then what can education system do in there? I think education system can be actually very well placed to deal with these challenges. In the first place, changes in the successful reforms in the education system demonstrate that the Western education system is superior to any other proposed system. And this is what I think Despina was referring to, that the constant theme of the adverse propaganda is that either our system or either Western system is not relevant or adequate, or that they are not doing enough for Georgia. So success of Western-oriented education reforms in Georgia can be crucial in that regard. And second is also that the education system increases social mobility in Georgia, which creates the sense of fairness, a sense of fairness among the population, which is absolutely necessary for enhancing the sense of legitimacy of the state institutions and also trust in state institutions. So now let me move to the Western contribution to these efforts, and they have been absolutely crucial, and they remain crucial in the success of the transformation of Georgian education system, and then as a consequence to enhancing Georgia's national resilience. We already talked about STEM and MCC and San Diego University collaboration. Exchange programs, as Ambassador said, are very important there. And they were especially important, I would say, in the 1990s, that they were the only gleam of hope, glimmer of hope for the generation of Georgians. And if you look at successive governments in Georgia, the leaders are essentially the beneficiaries, especially early beneficiaries of those exchange programs. We have to also mention NATO's contribution to Georgia's science development. So these will be, in conjunction with the government's efforts to double the state funding of education, this collaboration with Western states and governments will probably be crucial to advancing Georgia's education reforms and then also national resilience. But with this, let me be a bit, not critical, but let me suggest a couple of things that I think is lacking from the efforts of national education reform. The path to increased trust and legitimacy is often thought to go through economic performance, and we heard some of these arguments. These are very, very valid arguments. And hence, if you look at government performance and government programs, there is very heavy reliance on vocational training, which is, of course, absolutely crucial to Georgia's economy and economic success. But I would also argue that besides, emphasis should also be put on the highest level of education, which is graduate education. And here, I very often, like mantra, I just always speak about American and also partly British experience of graduate schools that combined research with teaching at the highest level, which was a very efficient engine for societal and economic development throughout decades, post-Second World War decades in the United States and in the West in general. Let me point out why I think this highest level graduate education enhances resilience. In the first place, that is where, due to the very nature of science and research, this is where you have the genuine culture of democratic pluralism, which then has multiplication effect, and if you will, it sort of filters down, or trickles down to the rest of the society. And second is that through enhancing that top-level research education combination, you are also contributing to increased critical thinking and better public policy debates. And this brings me to the final point, which is about short-term contribution of the education system to national resilience, and that is through fostering fact and evidence-based public policy debates in Georgia. Not the sound bites, not the bickering on social media, but fact and evidence-based public policy debates. And this is also, my direct responsibility at the moment, to foster through the Parliamentary Center for Research, in the run-up to the next year's election, to somehow foster the quality, to augment the quality of public policy debates in Georgia, starting in the Parliament. And there can be two goals, or two ways, how education, how academia, if you will, and research institutions can contribute to that. In the first place, it is diminishing polarization in the political spectrum, which is very, very often directly exploited by the adversaries. Polarization is the vehicle very often to sowing the seeds of discord, doubt, and misinformation. And second is repudiating adversarial narrative and disinformation by critically examining, basically developing critical skills throughout society, but through educational institutions, by including those educational institutions in the public debates to essentially dissect every kind of adversarial narrative fed by disinformation. So to conclude, the major contribution of the education system to national resilience should be through trust, legitimacy, patriotism, optimism, if you will, and the belief in greater national cause. Thank you.
For bringing on the table the whole spectrum of educational institutions in Georgia. And I would say also, I mean, before giving the floor to our last speaker, I would say that Georgia has a narrative to tell that I'm afraid it's underdeveloped. And this national narrative has to go through education, because Georgia is a success story. And this has not been very well promoted, both inside and outside the country. I mean, it's not my role, of course, but just to underpin some elements. I mean, Georgia is the most democratic country in this region by far. I mean, Georgia has been through very smooth political transition throughout 20 years, the last 20 years. I mean, it's a vibrant society, dynamic. People speak out their minds. Certainly there are deficiencies in the media, in the government, in the opposition, but these are traits normal for a democratic society. Georgia has a story to tell that I'm afraid you are not telling to the outside world. So just, some food for thought. Thank you. And on this note, I pass the floor to our last speaker. And we expect from you to have all remedies now, you know?
Am I on? Yeah. Thank you for inviting me, and it's wonderful to be here, and it's only my second time in Georgia, and I keep asking myself, how is it possible not to fall in love with Georgia and the Georgian people? So thank you for inviting me. When I was a journalist, I used to say, let's just cut through the noise and let's headline the story. And now I'm an academic, I reply, well, no, it's very complicated. And so what I'd like to do is just ask for your patience and suggest that I want to kind of problematize, I want to make it a bit more complicated than offering simple solutions, because those complications, that complexity doesn't just affect Georgia, it affects all Western democracies. Tying resilience to education is tricky. Education traditionally relies on the transmission of knowledge from experts top down, if you like. While resilience, at its best, is self-generated from the ground up, from individuals and community, freed from the hand of the state. Resilience works slowly and quietly, best where people use social capital and family and friends networks to sustain shocks to their community lives. It's about recovery and prevention. Self-reliance should not be a means for the state to devolve its responsibilities under a social contract, nor a shortcut for government to save money. I run a master's program in strategic communications at one of the UK's leading research and teaching universities. The UK is a global hub for education. 50% of the country's young people are at university. nearly 500,000 undergraduate and postgraduate students come from outside the country. 100,000 plus alone from China. In the information age, and with the resurgence of great power politics, democratic societies are increasingly vulnerable to subversion of their political status quo through various means. Through information theft by malign actors, through the spread of deliberate disinformation and accidental misinformation into the domestic media space, and constraints placed upon freedom of speech through economic manipulation. But there are other trends. And these affect the broader learning climate of student populations as they crisscross the world to pursue their studies. Students able to travel draw increasingly from a body of cosmopolitan, westernized knowledge with aligned learning techniques and common assumptions. Now, my job as a university teacher is to open up, I think, the imaginations of my students, not to manufacture political activists. And yet, still, I ask myself, are we adequately equipping our students for a future in a complex geopolitical world? Not simply equipping them to compete in global marketplaces for better employment. Rather, creating global citizens, not simply global consumers. Citizens able to identify and counter threats to the fundamental rights of living in a liberal democracy. And so I have 2 points. And one, change starts with language. Language is the entry point for subversion as well. But it gets more difficult. Today, young people, this is what I observe, having now been teaching for the last 14 years, young people appear less inclined to read, absorb, and think critically. And this is about short attention span, sure. It's about abuse, a lack of sensitivity to language, and maybe understandably, but I hope not, it's about not wanting to do the difficult thinking, the stuff that makes your head hurt. And recently I've seen a trend towards students searching for information, but settling for what is easily accessed and easily digested. And I think we can only partly blame the speed of the internet, algorithmic search engines, or the drowning out of the written word by visual imagery. Emoji and social media language push thinking language to instrumental extremes, not to critical nuance. I encourage students to understand systematic disinformation campaigns on an industrial scale that come from Moscow and St. Petersburg. Last year, 14 of my master's students wrote and published with NATO a book called Fake News, A Roadmap. Good. I try to guide my students through the ambiguities of Beijing's soft and hard power strategic communications, through its Belt and Road Initiative on the one hand, and its military kinetic actions in the China Seas on the other. At the same time, my students intern with NATO Strategic Communications Center of Excellence in Riga, Latvia, to expose them to the front line of understanding disinformation and hybrid subversion. As a former journalist, I value fact-checking, despite their very clear, very obvious limitations. Even better is to instill evidence-based reporting instincts and fact-checking on day one training of young professional journalists. Meanwhile, and I think this is a critical element, supporting independent journalists and independent media outlets financially should logically follow on where media economic models are collapsing worldwide. Education and resilience are not an afterthought. Individuals have to learn to think and communicate for and between themselves in information and solidarity networks. Which takes me to a second point, that in the network society, students share concerns, deep concerns, about unresolved fallout from the 2008 financial crisis. They fear for climate change. They deplore governments' inability to reduce conflict around the world, to reduce the rising number of war refugees and economic migrants. They are politically aware, but so often use their networks to secure jobs rather than organize to defend democracy. Some do organize politically on the ground in physical networks and online social networks. Yet, it remains local, fragmented within national projects. Future success, I believe, hangs on these same students developing self-help and resilience, not through what we teach in network theory and in political science, but in how they connect personal networks both inside and outside their countries to preserve freedoms of expression, assembly, and movement. So how can European and US governments further create support and funding climates to develop civil society networks across European countries to bridge into and out of, for example, Georgia's rich heritage of social networks? How can NATO further assist change on the ground through transnational support of young people's resilience groups? After all, I was about to say they, but actually I'm looking at you, and you are the leaders of tomorrow. You're the ones who are going to have to live with the long-term consequences of Russian disinformation and Chinese ambiguity. Better informed and better educated self-help networks that act within transnational feedback loops should be encouraged to flower in civil society, supported judiciously but not intrusively by the state, creating people-centered governance to push for responsive change. That's no easy task. And it takes, guess what? State money. Such initiatives embed in trust between government and governed. Yet in the disinformation debate, I think we have to remember one thing. In a healthy democracy, it is fundamental to know when to trust and when to distrust the state. Trust is not a blank check. We must assign it with care. A generation of enthusiastic and intelligent young people is being challenged by the habits inherent in today's fast-moving, short attention span, and algorithmically selective media environment. Educators need to encourage self-reliance, self-critique, self-help, but acquired and built through peer-to-peer networks of teaching and support. Resisting disinformation does not come with an instruction manual, but it must be nurtured in personal responsibility. The demands individuals make upon themselves, and our role is to smooth that path.